The tape recordings you are about to hear were recorded in undisclosed locations more than 20 years ago. They were made on an old microcassette recorder and have never been played publicly before. Some of the things that are said may be both difficult to understand due to the quality of the tapes and troubling to hear due to content. Listener discretion is advised.
A historic day at Stormont after 2 years of talks and after a generation of bloodshed and decades of division and acrimony, George Mitchell ushers in what the whole island hopes will be a new era of peace.
On April 10th, 1998, Good Friday, there was new hope for peace in Northern Ireland. That was the day multiple political parties signed what came to be called the Good Friday Agreement. The goal was to finally put an end to the violence of the Troubles that had plagued Northern Ireland for 30 years.
This agreement proves that democracy works. You will never solve the problems of Northern Ireland by violence. You will only make them worse.
Today, I hope that the burden of history can at long last start to be lifted from our shoulders.
Militants on both sides of the conflict signed the agreement. The ceasefire they had agreed to not long before was becoming permanent. Paramilitary groups like the Provisional IRA agreed to a decommissioning process for their weapons.
They have chosen hope over hate, the promise of the future over the poison of the past. And in so doing, already they have written a new chapter in the rich history of their island, a chapter of resolute courage that inspires us all.
That's President Bill Clinton, who sent Special Envoy George Mitchell to help guide the negotiations. The United States' participation speaks to the deep connection between Ireland and America. In fact, the current number of Americans who consider themselves Irish is 5 times the number of Irish people on the Emerald Isle. The Good Friday Agreement was overwhelmingly ratified by popular votes in both the Republic and the North. The agreement is complex. It included decommissioning by paramilitary groups, anti-discrimination laws, the system of government for Northern Ireland. We could go on about it for hours. But one important part of the deal opened the door for a potential reunification of Ireland down the road. It's called the Principle of Consent. It states that a reunified Ireland could only be achieved with the consent of voters in the Republic and, more importantly, in the North.
By the time the Good Friday Agreement was reached in the spring of 1998, Dave Rupert has been undercover in militant Republican circles for more than 4 years. One thing he's become accustomed to is the infighting. Internal conflicts among paramilitary groups have been going on as long as the British and Irish conflict has. When we interviewed an Irish Republican from Chicago, Colin Fagan, he really put it best.
It's a joke, but sometimes when 3 Irishmen get together, the first thing to do is split.
The joke goes, when 3 Irishmen get together, the first thing they do is split. Dave began his spy work by befriending 2 reputed IRA stalwarts, Joe O'Neill and Vincey Murray. He later found out they didn't associate with one another because they were in different wings of the militant rebel movement.
They hadn't talked since '86.
Interesting.
Right. And I thought they had, but they hadn't. And I thought that,
There was a dialogue.
yeah, they're both Republicans and they're both 15 miles or 20 miles apart.
Problem. They're
Yeah.
always fighting amongst each other.
Even Joe, when Joe...
You have to remember the goal of Irish republicanism: one unified republic covering the entire island, without British involvement. For many Republicans, anything less than that is a compromise that won't stand. Sean Pagashnik may have put it best in capturing the sentiment of the most infamous IRA leader of the time.
I mean, Mickey McKevitt, in that meeting in Gweedore in 1997, is saying, you guys are betraying everything we fought for. What have we been fighting for 20 years? Why did all these people have to die? Right? Why have I been living on the run for all these years? You're now telling me that it's just to share power with the Unionists in the illegitimate Orange Statelet?
Republicans, particularly militant Republicans who don't agree with the Good Friday Accords, have come to be called dissident Republicans.
This is why I have a problem with the whole term dissident. And I've argued this point forever with some colleagues, and you kind of give up after a while. But if you're a dissident, you have to ask the question, what are you dissenting from? because you're dissenting from Sinn Féin orthodoxy and Sinn Féin's road to compromise. But a dissident is somebody who should be breaking from established teaching. And in fact, the dissidents are the ones who are staying true to traditional IRA values.
Professor and writer Marissa McGlinchey echoes the irony of calling them dissident.
It implies something new. And really, the thing is that dissident republicanism, it has been there since '86, and I mean, ideologically, it's been there since the beginning.
They're doing the same thing that IRA groups, large or small, have been doing since the 1920s, which is maintaining a certain level of instability in a state that you oppose. You will never accept compromise in a state that must not be reformed. It must be destroyed. It must be annihilated. It must cease to exist.
Dave has learned about Republican orthodoxy. He knows the history. When another treaty comes along that preserves Northern Ireland, the last thing to expect is unity. I'm Abden Palish.
I'm Bob Hergeth.
In partnership with Entropy Media,
This is Underbelly, the rebel kind.
Now, he went as quickly as he arrived. He was gone within a few minutes. I never saw him again.
Benjamin Franklin said it. When we need to all hang together, we must certainly all hang separately.
These people were murdering our people for the guts of 30 years. Not an inch, no surrender. We will never compromise with terrorists. We will never have terrorists in our government.
35 years, but they've come in from the cold, they come in from the wilderness, and we have them now. Never! That's what I say to you. Never!
By the time of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, Dave has found his way deep into the Irish Republican movement. He's been accepted as a Yank who wants to contribute and is a true believer. It all started with his comment about the IRA needing to send more body bags back to Britain.
And again, it wasn't a statement of support, so to speak, or observation, but immediately I was a local hero.
But now he's ferrying envelopes full of cash from American supporters and even speaking at Republican political events. But from the beginning, we always wondered, how'd he do it? Now we know he was clever, charming, and his meandering career path gave him the right experience to create an unlikely but effective cover story as a spy. He had gone places trained intelligence agents never reached. Dave also learned over the years that mentioning just one small fraction of his bloodline could really make people's ears perk up.
This guy, a good friend of mine, who was one of the company officers, they called me from camp one day. He says, "There's no minorities in your officer." I said, "Hell yeah." I said, "Indian? Really?" And she worked that was a joke. I said, "Mohawk." "Oh, okay." Well, that was kind of the way it was left, right?
When Dave was working in the trucking business, long before becoming a spy, a friend in his company calls to ask if anyone in Dave's office is a minority. Dave casually mentions that he has a trace of Mohawk Indian ancestry, not expecting the company to actually run with it. He says he was joking that qualified him as a minority.
Next thing I know, they bid on Chrysler, and I had probably 10% of the volume in the company in my office. So they bid the thing on Chrysler as that I'm a Mohawk Indian, and 10% of their business is with an agency that's Mohawk Indian, and it was just a joke. I've been from up for about a year. It was a joke. I said, I'm about 12%, 12.5% Indian. I said, that's good enough.
We can't even begin to get into the controversial history of modern white Americans claiming Native American heritage. But Dave does have the genealogy to show his Mohawk ancestor.
My father's family would have been Germans that were Lutheran, I believe, was the had to leave Germany because of a religion factor. Went to England, came to the U.S., here we're going to send you to a new land, and we're going to give you this land, but you got to pay for it.
Dave says in the 1700s, his family showed up in what would become upstate New York to work land the British offered them.
So the Revolutionary War comes along. My father's family was on our side.
Right.
And so they had to go to Canada. And this is where the Mohawk Indian came to, because the first grandfather that came over from England. There was a shortage of women, so he married Catherine Littlefarn was her name. Anybody from northern New York whose family's been there any length of time has got Indian root.
Way back in Dave's family tree is Catherine Littlefawn, a Mohawk Indian. Dave says it's common for white folks in that area to have Native ancestors.
Well, my great-great-grandmother's name was Catherine Littlefarn, and what would that mean? Coming from the U.S., if your grandmother's name was Catherine Littlefarn's not like, yeah. I said, well, that would mean that she was Indian, yeah. And she happened to be Mohawk.
We tracked down his family history, and his father's family traces back, through the Rupert name, to Potter Rupert, who married Catherine Littlefawn Rupert. That couple's son, Adam, begins the line from George, Philip, James, Donald, and finally to David. So there is a connection. However tenuous, it proved to be a crucial part of his ability to win people over.
And I would actually say that I was only actually like 12.5% Mohawk. That I didn't say I was half Mohawk. That was something that people made up. Okay. And I would say that I was German and Mohawk. And then I usually subsequently say, well, actually like 12.5% Mohawk. Is that?
We know how much Irish Republicans loved Dave's Native American connection, because many remembered it and told reporters when Dave's identity as a spy became public. News stories from the time frequently accentuated what was to Irish and English readers a fascinating detail.
I'd play big on it, because that was a big, that had a lot of meaning in the Republican circle,
As he says, this minute Mohawk heritage was something Dave played up to ingratiate himself with Irish Republicans.
They say, that was the story. I was 50% Mohawk. I'm about 6% Mohawk. It sounded good because the Irish have, especially the Republican Irish, have a real affinity for the Indian problem.
Dave told some people 12%. He sometimes says 6%. We did the math, and it's actually more like 3%. But whatever. It was a hit with his Irish friends. There's a reason that Dave's Indian story resonated with the Irish, because of the shared experience of having been occupied by oppressive forces for centuries.
There's a big affinity from Irish Republicans to the American Indian because of just a general downtrodden thing. Plus the fact, I think, in the 1849 and the state of famine, that the American Indians gathered up a couple $100 and sent it over to the Irish.
Back in 1847, at the height of the Great Hunger in Ireland, as millions died or left the island, the Choctaw Nation raised $170, the equivalent of about $5,000 today, to send to Ireland to help. This is a big deal for the Irish. Every Irish child learns in grade school about the Native Americans coming to their aid. In recent years, the Prime Minister of Ireland visited the Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma to give thanks. The chief of the Choctaw Nation visited Ireland in 2017 to dedicate the Kindred Spirits Memorial that commemorates the gift. When Dave said he was part Mohawk, his IRA friends loved it.
My name is Scott Manning Stevens, an associate professor of Native American and Indigenous Studies at Syracuse University.
This is an expert I spoke to about the history of who many referred to as the Mohawk people, to get a better understanding of this connection Dave told friends about.
I'm always a little leery when people say native blood or something like that. It sounds mystified to me.
The Mohawk people have a misunderstood past, which is unsurprising here in America, given the colonist approach to the native peoples of the land, and our culture's continued dismissiveness. Mohawk isn't even their name.
Mohawk's a name given to us by our enemies. It's the Algonquin enemies. When the English said, who are those horrible people we're fighting? They said, we call them Mohawks, which means cannibal. That's an English thing where they basically call any warrior native Mohawk. And just we get tied into all these, anything about violence.
Like Dave said, he was not as Mohawk as he played himself up to be to the Irish, but it had a purpose.
The Choctaw, who had intermarried in the U.S. with some Irish immigrants, heard about these starving relatives, their kin, in Ireland. And even in the midst of Indian removal, the Trail of Tears, the Choctaw raised money to send to Ireland.
It's a kinship that endures.
It's just a good feeling between, we used to jokingly call it Celts and Pelts, because the feeling of we have a common oppressor, just someone busy trying to steal our native languages, make us models of their version of civilization.
Make us models of their version of civilization? Does that sound familiar? Wasn't it reportedly Churchill who said the Irish refused to be English? As for Dave, he always drew on his unique experiences to accomplish his goals. His Mohawk ancestry was something he emphasized to win over his Republican friends, create a more convincing cover, and ultimately deflect suspicion.
The Irish Republican Army was founded in the early 20th century to fight a revolution. But when the Anglo-Irish Treaty established Northern Ireland, the island and the IRA was torn in two. Suddenly there was a pro-treaty IRA and an anti-treaty IRA. It was the first of many splits that would develop among militant Irish Republicans over the next century. As you've begun to understand by now, the goal of republicanism has always been simple: one united republic free from British interference. That's Republican orthodoxy. Over the course of the 20th century, sometimes in the name of peace, some Republicans will agree to various degrees of compromise. But there will always be those who refuse to compromise, and even those who will forsake peace in the name of Republican orthodoxy. The so-called true Republican would split from the compromisers and form a new faction, moving further into what others would call extremist territory. That's why many have come to call them dissident Republicans. It's a divide that Dave has been navigating in Republican circles, both in Ireland and the U.S., for years.
Benjamin Franklin said it. We need to all hang together. We most certainly all hang separately. Right. Now, Joe and his people should have been down there supporting McKevitt. But what's Joe's thing in the paper was, he's just trying to attack true Republicans. Because Sinn Féin are Republicans and Féin are supposed to be true Republicans.
What Dave is alluding to here is the concept of a true Republican. Because when we talk about infighting and schisms among Irish Republicans, it's almost always over who is staying true to the cause.
So there's different levels of, where you stand in the thing. Obviously, the present government, it would be Republicans from 23.
Yes.
So, at some point in time, they were all rebels. They just kept peeling off.
What Dave's talking about is a simplification of a lot of history and strife here, so stay with us. Dave is talking about Sinn Féin, the Republican political party that established the Irish government in 1919, claiming sovereignty over the entire island. Britain initially fought the move, then agreed to a treaty. That treaty partitioned the North into a new territory that remained part of the UK. The partition fueled a civil war in Ireland, with the pro-treaty side victorious. As the dust settled on the Irish Civil War, with the partition in place, those in Ireland's government became a party known as Fine Gael, and Sinn Féin began their long policy of abstaining from any government that didn't include all of Ireland. To them, the government of the Republic isn't legitimate because it excludes the North. In our interviews 20 years ago, Dave constantly referred back to a particular split that happened in 1986. This was the split between Sinn Féin and those who would found Republican Sinn Féin. It happened when Sinn Féin leaders, including Gerry Adams, broke that long-standing policy of abstentionism and decided they would take seats in Ireland's parliament, known as the Dáil Éireann.
The first schism with O'Neill was in 86. It actually started in 84 and finished in 86. The first thing that happened was I think that Jerry Adams got elected so that the control of Sinn Féin went from the south to Belfast, as he was referred to the ghetto mullah. And so Roy O'Brady didn't get to be president anymore.
At the time, the president of Sinn Féin was Rory O'Brady, who was a reputed founder of the Provisional IRA and a longtime leader of the group. But a growing movement by younger members of the party, led by Jerry Adams, took over, leading Rory and his faithful, including Dave's pal Joe O'Neill, to split and form a new party called Republican Sinn Féin.
We spoke to former Republican Sinn Féin president Des Dalton to walk us through it.
Effectively, your Republican Sinn Féin came out of a split in the Republican movement in 1986, which was basically on the issue of recognizing the legitimacy of the Southern Irish state. That would be a fundamental principle for Republicans from that period, from 1922, and had led to other splits, including, the formation of the governing party, Fianna Fáil and others who had gone that particular route. And again, that was the first fundamental break since 1969-70, since the previous split with the Workers' Party.
Des Dalton mentions that this is the latest in a long line of splits over whether and how to stay the course.
So 1986, basically, Rory O'Brady, if you like, versus Jerry Adams were the two sides of that argument, of that debate. The Adams side won on the vote at the Ardèche at the conference, and Republican Sinn Féin then came out of those people, those delegates who left, led by people like Rory O'Brady and Daithí O'Connell.
It all came to a head at what's called an Ardèche, an Irish political convention.
We have not been wrong for 65 years. We have not been wrong for all those 70 years. We have been right, and we should continue to be right.
This is audio from that event.
And those in Leinster House who have done everything, the firing squads, the prison cells, the internment camps, the hunger strikes, the lot, and weren't able to break this movement, that they can come and say, at last, we have them towing the line. It took us 65 years, but they've come in from the cold, they come in from the wilderness, and we have them now. Never. That's what I say to you. Never.
A motion to allow its elected officials to participate in Irish government is passed, and those against it walk out of the event. The group forms what's called Republican Sinn Féin. While Sinn Féin has long been considered the political arm of the Provisional IRA, Republican Sinn Féin becomes inextricably linked to the Continuity IRA. The IRA and its various branches have long been classified as terrorist organizations. We asked former Republican Sinn Féin President Des Dalton if Jerry Adams' decision to lead Sinn Féin back into the Irish government made him a traitor to the Republican cause.
If you wanted to go down that road, I don't necessarily myself get into that kind of language, but I mean, ultimately, they may be whatever they may wish to describe themselves, but to me, they're not Irish Republicans. And of course, the lesson of history has been, each time the pattern has been, that far from working the system, they were ultimately absorbed by the system and ultimately turned against the base that they had left, that traditional Republican base, and ended up interning and executing those people. And, in 1986, people like Jerry Adams said, this is different.
Des Dalton puts it simply. While he might not call Jerry Adams a traitor, he says Adams is not a true Republican because he led Sinn Féin in compromise, participating in an Irish government that didn't include all of Ireland. We reached out to Jerry Adams for this podcast, but he declined to be interviewed. Rory O'Brady, who died in 2013, led the walkout at the Ardèche and founded Republican Sinn Féin.
And Rory O'Brady views himself as the true president of Ireland. Well, he really thinks he's president of Ireland. Because of this General Tommy Maguire deal, you understand about that?
Tom Maguire was elected to Ireland's first government a century ago. By the 1990s, he was the last surviving member and an almost mythical figure for Republicans.
Where he died and said, okay, I'm going to die, but I'm going to will Ireland to you. And that's technically what he did. He was the last surviving member of the original Dáil. And he was about 92, and he died, and he said, okay, I'm picking Rory O'Brady and Republican Sinn Féin.
Sean Pagachnik explains the evolution of hardline Republican thinking.
If we look at the IRA in the 1960s, before the Modern Troubles kicks off, their whole mindset was, if you looked at the IRA Green Book, their field manual, their official position was, cloud cuckoo land stuff, but they genuinely believed that the IRA Army Council was the legitimate government of Ireland, and that both states on this island were illegitimate partitionist creations of Quislings and, stooges of the British. So they come out of a culture where you're in a tiny smoke-filled room and you're the legitimate government of Ireland. And really what Gerry Adams did was he took them out of that culture and said, no, actually, we can be popular. We can get majority support for the politics of our situation if we just get real.
To an outsider like Dave, these feuds were intricate, Byzantine, and sometimes a little odd.
If you were a Republican Sinn Féin, well, gee, we can't really a real Republican unless we speak Gaelic. That would be the mentality. Republican Sinn Féin at different times would say, well, gee, unless you walked out in 86 with us, you weren't with us. And there was one of the guys, I name was Thomas. He said to me at the time, he says, officially, I can't be a real Republican because in 86, I was only 14 years old. So I couldn't walk out with him. I couldn't even go. But he said, I've been in the IRA since I was 14.
Dave says it feels like Republican Sinn Féin could be strict and unyielding.
But according to Republican Sinn Féin, if you make the bar high enough, you don't have to worry about getting too many people in to do too much damage. They've always held that they didn't have any informants because they were so careful on who they took in. Of course, that was before they knew they had me. But they didn't have any because they didn't have any people.
This is an important moment in history for Dave's time in Ireland. A key part of the agreement required voters in the Republic of Ireland to amend their constitution, relinquishing a territorial claim over Northern Ireland. That was a big olive branch to Northern Ireland's unionists, and not an easy ask for many Irish citizens. But they overwhelmingly approved it, and the Good Friday Agreement ended that claim. When notoriously stringent Republicans are presented with a laundry list of concessions, Dave is well-versed enough to know what comes next.
When the Good Friday Agreement is signed by leaders of the UK, Ireland, and Northern Ireland, it was a historic moment. But the real test came in May of 1998, when voters on both sides of the border had to choose whether to let go of the past to be able to live with each other. The agreement included a commitment to, quote, the mutual respect, the civil rights, and the religious liberties of everyone in the community. One of the most controversial pillars of the Good Friday Agreement was the early release of paramilitary prisoners. It was one of many sacrifices civilians had to make in the name of peace. You might have seen the hugely popular and critically acclaimed Channel 4 series Dairy Girls, which follows a group of teens living in Northern Ireland during the 1990s. There's a scene addressing the Good Friday Agreement between the main character and her grandfather that perfectly captures the sentiment of many civilians as the older generation gives way to the younger generation.
And the people who took those lives, they're just going to walk free. What if we do it and it was all for nothing? What if we vote yes and it doesn't even work?
And what if it doesn't? What if no one else has to die? What if all this becomes a ghost story? You'll tell your Waynes one day. A ghost story they'll hardly believe.
The show was based on creator Lisa McGee's own experience growing up in Derry, and it resonated with not only Irish and Northern Irish audiences, but with viewers all over the world. It's a testament to the will of the people for peace that the Good Friday Agreement was approved overwhelmingly by voters north and south. Again, reporter Sean Pagachnik.
When the referendum was called, there was overwhelming support in the Republic of Ireland. That was 94% approval?
Yes.
I'd still like to know who these 6% voting against were. right? They're real cranky people. They will not vote for whatever the government wants.
Up in the north,
There were still some who voted no, but 29% voted no. And overwhelmingly, that's the Democratic Unionist Party base right there in 1998 saying no to compromise with Sinn Féin and the IRA. These people were murdering our people for the guts of 30 years. Not an inch, no surrender. We will never compromise with terrorists. We will never have terrorists in our government.
voters chose peace and disarmament over continued strife. As Sean noted, the largest percentage of no voters were Unionists. But some in the Irish Republican community viewed the Good Friday Agreement as another loss in a long line of defeats, spurred by traitors to the cause. It came on the heels of a 2-year ceasefire by the Provisional IRA and the rival paramilitary groups like the Ulster Volunteer Force. And just like Republican Sinn Féin scoffed at Gerry Adams giving in and joining the Dáil in 1986, the Continuity IRA and other militant Republicans like Mickey McKevitt considered the Good Friday Agreement yet another betrayal of true Republican ideals. How could we settle for anything less than a united Ireland? Here's former Republican Sinn Féin President Des Dalton again.
If you like, that led then to the two sides then emerging from 97, 98. Now, obviously, at that stage then, you had other groups, other people who had left the Provisional Sinn Féin in 1997, people like Mickey McKevitt and so on. They'd left on other issues. They had supported Gerry Adams in 86.
According to Des Dalton, Mickey McKevitt had supported Gerry Adams and Sinn Féin participating in the Irish government, but he found the Good Friday Agreement to be unacceptable.
Particularly on the issue of the decommissioning and issue of unionist consent, or the unionist veto, as we would call it. That acceptance of the Mitchell principles by the Adams leadership in 1997 and led to the emergence of the Church to County sovereignty and the real IRA and so on.
Des refers to the principle of consent as the unionist consent. Remember, the principle of consent refers to the agreement that a majority vote on both sides of the border would be required to unite Ireland.
And it's, fundamental difference, really. Effectively what they've done is they have, and this would have been the argument with Republicans in 1998, that the 1998 agreement was effectively Treaty Mark II. It was effectively just a continuation of these previous agreements that were put in place from 1922 on. I think there's been something like 5 Anglo-Irish agreements.
Many Republicans are enraged. The Unionists shouldn't have a choice, just like Ireland didn't have a choice when it was invaded. Remember the goal: one unified republic now.
The Republicans would always argue that that's exactly what they were. They were agreements, but none of them ever provided a settlement because they all failed to address the fundamental cause of the conflict in Ireland, and that was the continued British presence in the 6 counties and the imposition of partition. And until those issues were addressed, Republicans would argue that a real settlement, a real lasting and just and peaceful settlement wasn't possible.
Des Dalton says the Good Friday Agreement is just a sequel to the treaty that established Northern Ireland in the first place, and those who agreed to it are betraying the Republican mission. The Good Friday Agreement fails to address the true Republican desire to rid Ireland of the British. History repeats itself. Just like in 1986, when Republican Sinn Féin split off from Sinn Féin, there's another split over the Good Friday Agreement. When Dave Rupert arrives in Ireland, there are 2 main camps: the Provisional IRA, usually associated with Sinn Féin, and the Continuity IRA, usually associated with Republican Sinn Féin. But when the Good Friday Agreement comes along, there's a new faction, a group that will become known in the press as the real IRA, led by Mickey McKevitt. McKevitt's opinion carries some weight, not only because he's a longtime Provisional IRA leader, but also because of his partner and future wife, Bernadette Sands, the sister of legendary IRA hunger striker Bobby Sands, who died in British custody in 1981. Journalist Sean O'Driscoll again.
They were worried about the real IRA because of Bernadette Sands McKevitt because she has the name. She has the Sands name. She's Bobby Sands' sister. And if Bobby Sands' sister is saying, through the Good Friday Agreement, let's keep fighting, then that has an influence on many, many people who are sitting on a border fence.
Bernadette Sands splits off from Sinn Féin and creates the 32-county sovereignty movement, which will become known as the political wing of the real IRA.
I could see in that period, 97, 98, that there was a beginning of a consolidation, if you like, of that kind of traditional Republican base. And that became much more defined, because before that, it was much more difficult for people. Unless you were really clued into the ideology of all of this, a lot of people couldn't see the difference between what Gerry Adams was saying or people like Rory Brawley was saying. But that all became very clear, very defined once the agreement was signed. And suddenly, you had people who previously would have been very supportive of Gerry Adams are coming out and saying, this is not what I signed up for.
Dave Rupert is right in the middle of all this. He's friends with Joe O'Neill, a member of the Continuity IRA aligned with Republican Sinn Féin who opposed the agreement. Des Dalton even remembers seeing Dave at a Republican Sinn Féin event in 1997.
The closest I ever came to him was, I never met him before, I never met him, or I never spoke to him or whatever. I remember being at a Republican Sinn Féin Ardèche in 1997 conference or national conference. And then I remember on the Saturday morning, this guy being introduced to the crowd by Joe O'Neill as Dave Rupert. And like, he was physically, he was a very striking individual. He was very tall. I remember he would have been about 10 feet away from me. He stood up and he was introduced to the crowd. And somebody made the point, he'd been stopped by the special branch coming in, and it shows the fear, the support that we're getting from around the world, blah, blah, blah. Now, he went as quickly as he arrived. He was gone within a few minutes. I never saw him again after that.
Dave is the big Yank at the Ardèche. He has put in his dues at the pubs, listening to the songs, learning the politics. He's been taken in by Joe O'Neill and the Continuity IRA. He's deftly maneuvered a tangled web of loyalties and politics for nearly 4 years. And he's about to see up close what happens when IRA groups want to make a point with violence. With nothing left to gain from the political process, militant Republican groups like Continuity IRA and the real IRA led by Mickey McKevitt turned to more destructive action.
They've done a whole bunch of previous bombings to that. Let the British know, hey, we can, it's locked. Going in and calling the warning, they move everybody away from it. Does 10 million pounds damage or something. Everybody's scared, and nobody gets killed.
In an effort to derail the peace envisioned by the Good Friday Agreement, militant Republicans would turn to one of their signature methods, setting off bombs to garner headlines and create fear, without harming the citizens they hoped to win over. But that tactic was about to go horribly wrong.
Of all the sad pictures you could see of the run-up to terrorist attacks in Northern Ireland, there's an image of a father and a child on his shoulders. And there was a kind of a community festival going on in Omagh on the day on August 15th, 1998, Saturday afternoon, beautiful sunny day. And the kid's on his shoulders, and in the background is the car. But you can see in this picture that people were standing around that bomb about to go off, and nobody had seen that it was a bomb.
That's next time on Underbelly, The Rebel Kind.
If you liked this episode of The Rebel Kind, you could do us a favor by leaving a positive review on whatever hosting service you're listening to us on.
The Rebel Kind is created and hosted by Bob Hergeth and Abden Palish. Executive producer, Anjay Nagpal. Written by Dalton Main, Abden Palish, and Bob Hergeth. Senior producer, Dalton Main.
Editing and sound design by Catherine Anderson. Original music by Dale Eisinger. Special thanks to musician Mark Akiksa for his beautiful performance of an Irish reel on a Native American flute. Mixing by Gerard Bauer. Show art by Rebecca Hendon.
Our show was recorded in the podcast studio at Roosevelt University. Our development producers were Danielle Elliott and Jen Swan.
Marketing support from Tessa Cairns-Clay. Production legal by Bruns, Brennan, and Barry. Legal clearance fair use by Rachel Strom at Davis Wright Tremaine.
From Entropy Media, the Underbelly series was created by Anjay Nagpal. Executive producer, Josh Fielstad. Executive producer, Gerard Bauer. Head of operations is Nuna Ebo. Project manager is Sebastian Perry. Associate producer, Heidi Rudvoets. Development and production support, Simona Kessler.
Special thanks to Flynn McRoberts for calling us in 20 years ago. This series is dedicated to the innocent victims of Northern Ireland's decades of violence.